Good to go?
Yep, everybody's good? All right, we're good to go.
All right. Tonight we have the board budget workshop. And so I wanted to talk first a little bit about the context of the budget. And then allow questions around the budget, but also anything else you want to talk about. So it's important to understand this is a unique budget. And it would be unique at any other time, not just because I'm here, but because the ESSER dollars, about $1.2 billion over the last 3.5 years, is ending at the end of this fiscal year. And that presents a challenge for almost any school district, but especially HISD, and I want to explain why. And before I explain why, I just want to cut to the chase to the end story so you know where we're headed with this. We've managed to balance the budget. We managed to have a budget that brings our fund balance no lower than $800 million, which was the goal, and also that puts us in a good fiscal position going forward, and that avoids the fiscal cliff that the past administration predicted that we would be in. It's the second most important thing this administration did this year. And to capture what that means and why is the last administration predicted a declining fund balance. That means a budget where we would have to dip into fund balance, which is a rainy day fund, for several years to come. This blue line is the line that the last administration predicted. This was not my graph, the original graph here, the blue line, that's the last administration's graph. This is our line, and this is where we'll be, and this is what we plan to do going forward. I can't overstate the importance of this. If we had not done what we did, which is zero-based budgeting in a way that still supported kids, supported teachers, and to get outcomes, we would be down here at the end of next year, and we would be even further down the following year. This is a fiscal crisis here. This is the fiscal cliff that they're talking about. You see how that steep decline? Well, we're not there. We're not going to be there. And that comes at a huge cost, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's cutting to the end. Why was it so hard? Why is this budget so different than normal years? Well, again, ESSER lies at the heart of all this, and ESSER's is a gift that keeps on giving, apparently, because we're having to deal with ESSER and the recurring costs. I'll talk about that in a second. But look at this this graph here, another graph the past administration presented. The top line is increasing central office expenditures, both in people and purchase services. So that's a rising number, so you can see millions of dollars increase. Remember that in 2019, the state allocation has remained flat since that time. What the state gives us in revenue so that we can take care of kids, teachers, etc. So that per pupil allotment has not increased since that time. And if you have an increasing expenditure rate of people and services, and this is just about central office, then you have to find the money somewhere. There's no additional money coming in, so you have to find this much money this year, this much money next year, and all this every year. So that's a lot of money to be found, or expenditures cut. And it wasn't cut. At the same time, enrollment is decreasing, as you can see here. The district has lost 25,000 kids over the last 5 years, or 6 years. And when you have in a regular year with a decrease in enrollment, then you have to cut expenses, unless you're getting more money from the state, which we are not. So if the enrollment declines, you have to decrease expenditures. You have to cut something. People or purchase service, something. So not only do you have to cut money because of the increase in central office expense, you also have to find a way to pay for the decline in enrollment. Why wasn't there any expenditures made, cuts to expenditures? So this graph I've shown before, it was a draft before, it's still a draft. You're going to get more precise numbers tonight from the workshop. And some of you may recognize this number is larger than what I originally said. And that's because when I said 450 million a month ago, when this chart was built, there's even more ESSER monies found in recurring expenses, and so this is the more accurate number. You'll get even further accuracy from Jim Terry tonight, CFO. But the point of this graph is still the same, which is this. Declining enrollment, this is a graph of declining enrollment. Of course, it goes up and down a little bit, but it actually goes down, but not at the same rate. This was not paid for. Well, how can you get away with not paying for a decline in enrollment? You use ESSER money. At the same time, purchase services increase, a lot of ESSER money paid for this. Again, a decrease in enrollment, now more kids, ESSER paid for that. Increase in purchase services, ESSER paid for that. This year, decrease in enrollment, ESSER was already in the budget that I took over. Remember, the board passed one in June, but they got here in June. So we didn't really change the budget. We didn't cut staff like we should have if it was a normal year. ESSER paid for this, ESSER paid for that. 2 years ago, salary increases. When you have a huge salary increase, and I'm going to say this loud and clear so people hear me, teachers deserve salary increases. And they deserve the one back in the fiscal year 23, which is 22-23 school year. They deserve that one, but at the same time, the district should have cut expenditures somewhere to pay for that. There wasn't any new revenue coming in. But ESSER paid for that as well. Long story short, next year's budget, the budget we're going to present to the board tonight, has a continuing decrease of enrollment, and we're going to pay for this. It has an increase in NES and some other action plan, and we're going to pay for this. Who pays for this? Well, we pay for that. We have now, ESSER ends. Somebody has to pay for the 20,000 kids who were not paid for prior. In other words, the loss of 20,000 students. We didn't gain more kids, so that loss is still not coming to the district. So, and if you want to be back at the blue line, you have to find cuts somewhere else. All total, the gap in the budget is about 528. Again, these are draft numbers. The final numbers will be given to the board in June, in June for approval. But they're pretty close now. I'd say pretty close now because every day we have budget to actuals, we have expenditures, and that affects the fund balance and the bottom line for this year, which will then affect it for next year. So there's going to be some changes, so that should not surprise anybody. But it's not going to change a lot, and you'll see that. So this is why this has been a huge difference in budgets of the past. The only way for us to have done this is what we call zero-based budgeting or modified zero-based budgeting so that we can effectively manage our departments find greater efficiency, and still continue to get results for kids. Our full expectation is we're not making an excuse and say because of the budget cuts we can't reform or continue to reform, or we can't continue to raise the quality of instruction, or we can't provide services to kids. What this team did, the finance department and all of central department was involved in this zero-based budgeting, was find a way to provide the services and get the outcomes we need for kids next year, even with this cut. Comes at a great cost because that meant we cut a lot of positions in central office. And that's very painful. Any cut time you cut, they're real people, real jobs. And so you can imagine what was going on in this building the last month as we had to lay people off, not starting immediately, but starting this summer. That's huge. And then cut purchase services. We cut $60 million at least in purchase services. That's a lot of contracts, a lot of vendors that are not going to receive that money in the city of Houston. So this is painful, and if the community feels that pain, and some folks are going to be angry about that, I totally understand that, because we certainly felt it here, and there are people that lost their real jobs here in the district. The one thing we did do, though, I think we did this well for the district, is we kept the cuts away from the classroom. What does that mean? That means, to the extent that we can, guys, I mean, you can't cut $450 million or find a gap of $500 million and say that's not going to affect anything in the schools. But when that child goes to the classroom next year, this student, fourth grade math or fourth grade language arts, this child, when he goes to the classroom, he will still have the same class size as he normally experiences. He will still have magnet programming or dyad programs, still dance, music, photography. That's not going to change. He's still going to have high quality instructional materials. He's still going to have a teacher, effective teacher. If he's in the NES world, he's still going to have teacher apprentices and learning coaches, even though we cut that back a little bit. He's still going to experience that, et cetera. So for a student, it's not going to be much different. This discussion and everything will and should not impact that child and their education, so we can still get the outcomes we need. But the other thing that will probably go unnoticed after this discussion, this moment, is that we will have prevented the district from falling to the fiscal cliff. That has, maybe short term it feels a lot of pain, but over the long haul, this right-sizing the district is one of the most important things we can do to serve the teachers and principals and the departments in this building and in the district as a whole, and it will serve the community well if TEA doesn't have to bail us out and fire the administration for fiscal mismanagement, even though it wasn't our fault. So that's the context. Tonight you're going to get the details of all of this. You'll see the overall line items, department budgets, and things like that. So you get a lot of detail, but just wanted to provide this context because it is different than what you've ever seen before. And a lot of other districts are in the same position, so I'm not trying to say this is just unique to HISD. I think what is unique is more than most districts, first of all, we're larger than most, but more than most, we probably put ESSER into recurring expenses. That COVID, by the way, I may have failed to say, ESSER is a COVID relief money. So we put COVID relief money into recurring expenses over the last 3.5 years that we should not have. All right, with that, let me take questions.
All right, who's first? Asher, go ahead.
So like looking back at the budget workshop notes from previous years, what I see is that they projected about $200 to $250 million deficits.
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain, like $250 million is not the $528 million gap. Can you explain the difference there?
Yeah, so What you're talking about is the deficit spending that the district anticipated, the last administration anticipated for this year.
For
And
24,
right,
25,
well, yes, but a little less than that. And what I don't have a chart for this, but I'll try to make it clear. This is where a fund balance should be for a district this size. And you notice before COVID, it was about here. And for some reason, I'm going to tell you that reason, it goes up pretty considerably, at least for these 2 years. The fund balance is a rainy day fund. So, and then it drops here this year. This is this year, end of this year, and then goes down steeply. The question is why. The district this year, the administration before me said we're going to decrease the fund balance by about 200 million or 150 million this year. And the reason why they could, and the reason why we can use the fund balance a little bit more, is because they were flush with money from ESSER, and so they could use ESSER to pay for general fund activities, people, and programs, and put the extra money into the fund balance. So drawing down the fund balance made sense for the last administration.
Right, I guess that wasn't exactly the substance of my question, which is, like, it seems like they were projecting this 200 to the number I saw was like 219 or something like that, $219 million deficit. So is the additional 520, is that partially because of new spending allocated by your administration, or what
No.
gives?
It's okay, so I don't want to go into too many details, but to answer your question, the deficit that they were projecting was the use of the fund balance. What they didn't account for is all the ESSER spending, right? You're going to see that in the slides tonight, that what they didn't account for that we would have to decrease in a real way is the ESSER monies that were in recurring expenses. So a lot of these positions that we have to cut, they were paid for by ESSER. A lot of the programs that we have to cut was paid for by ESSER. The salary increase, we're not going to cut salaries. I already told you we're actually going to increase them. Was paid for by ESSER. So while they noted a decrease in the fund balance, which they could because they increased it, they didn't account for all the ESSER dollars that would have to be cut.
So in
That's
other
the
words,
difference.
It was like bad math by the previous administration.
Not bad math, bad practice of paying using ESSER money to pay for recurring expenses. That's the problem.
So the sorts of things that you're having to cut this year, they were predicting this big drop off on this fiscal cliff because they were going to be, I mean, we can't predict what they would do, but they were projecting to use fund balance money to pay for the sorts of things that you feel like you have to cut.
So again, I don't want to confuse the audience because this is pretty technical stuff, but let me just give the shorthand version. They predicted to be here. They understood ESSER would end. So they knew, they could see in the budget what was the cost of all the salary increase, right? They didn't pay for the salary increase before, now they're going to have to pay for it. So you calculate the increase of salary 2 years ago, that has to be paid for. And so how are they going to pay for it? You either cut expenditures or you use your fund balance. You go into your savings, just like a house. And so they predicted that this administration would have to go into the fund balance pretty considerably in order to pay for the past things. Then they looked at enrollment. It's like, okay, the kids, we have 20,000 fewer kids than we had pre-ESSER. So they could calculate what money was going to come in, which was always lower, But now you have to account for that 20,000 kid loss. They could see they weren't going to be able to cut as many positions, or they didn't want to. So what would they do? Go back into the fund balance. So that's why they predicted this. Because I mean, it's accounting. You have to pay for the salary increase somehow. You have to pay for the loss of enrollment somehow. You either do one of two things. We could do this too. We could just go into the fund balance, $300 million. This is what they predicted. Then I only have to find $150 million or so. So yeah, I could do that too. And I'm telling you, we didn't do this because this is not good financial practice, but it was predicated upon poor practice from the last administration.
Ms. Margaret?
I understand when you right sides that you're saying these are the right number of teacher positions, and so there's a savings there if you have fewer teachers you're paying. But it seems like the number of principals stay the same, whoever's being the principal, but do you save money because you're replacing veteran principals with people who are brand new principals?
No, we're no thought to that. No thought to veteran, not veteran, because the difference in pay, anyway, even if we did think that way, it's so small. The difference is small, and we're not looking at veteran versus non-veteran years of experience. I think everybody knows we're looking at data, instruction, achievement, leadership, all of those pieces of data. And so that has nothing to do with experience level.
You were referencing the ESSER funding, COVID funding for the prior administration. I'm hoping I can get your reaction to Congresswoman Garcia today calling for the U.S. Department of Education to look into the audit of how those COVID relief funds were distributed and used.
So you may be conflating a couple things, but to answer your question directly, I think the federal government is going to look at COVID relief money, and TEA Texas Education Agency will play a role in that. And frankly, the federal government should look at not just HISD, but all of the ESSER spending across the country to say what was the bang for our buck? What did we gain from all of this money spent on school districts, not just HISD? That's being fiscally responsible. And frankly, and I've said it, and I'm sorry if some people in the last administration may be offended, but I can't point to a lot of bang for a buck. $1.2 billion. We have more failing schools today than we had before, and we didn't use that money to really improve outcomes for kids. And not only that, we use that money in a way that caused a huge fiscal cliff on the horizon.
All right, Devin, then back to Sam.
When you first started, you mentioned that balancing the budget was the second best thing that this administration has taken on and done. What was the first thing?
The first thing was conducting whole-scale systemic reform in 85 schools and instructional reform in the entire district. Whole-scale systemic reform in 85 NES schools, new education system schools, was a challenging feat because of the whole-scale nature of it. No other district has done this or even attempted to do it. Large urban districts I'm talking about. Large urban districts do not attempt whole-scale systemic reform. They only do piecemeal incremental reform, which has not worked in this country for at least 2 decades, probably 3. So that's why that was the number one thing.
Sam, go ahead.
Is there any world in which it would have been worth it to eat more into the fund balance, go below this 800 million level to stave off some of these cuts, which are going to be pretty painful for some sections of the district?
That is a great question. And the answer is yes and no. I'll tell you both parts. I already said that in a district this size, this is about right. And about right, what does that mean? For me, it means not only do you meet the TEA requirement of 90 days operating revenue, which is about $550 million, but you also maintain your AAA bond rating. So we stand a good chance of maintaining our AAA bond rating if we stay above the $800 million line. The other part of your question, though, is well-founded because we're going to wind up somewhere around here, 930. And so I originally wanted to give the board a budget that had $850 million fund balance this year. But because we're wind up higher than what we thought we would, I called the board and asked them if it would be okay in their mind if we could go to $800 million this year in order to put a 12% cap, in order to pay for curriculum in the PUA schools, in order to do more salaries for the non-NES. So because of that, we didn't go at 850. You don't see 850, you see 800 million fund balance in this district. So great question, very nuanced.
Any questions in the back before we come back to the front? All right, go ahead, Ashton.
So just to clarify, were you saying that this year's deficit was actually about 75 million less than expected previously?
Yeah, 870 was what if you go back and look at the budget for this year, we were projecting when we started this year that we would wind up with an $870 million fund balance. And it's going to be, you'll see tonight, again, I don't want to give you exact numbers and let Jim Terry do that, but it's around $930 million that we project we'll end the year with. That might fluctuate a little bit. You know, we're looking every day at actuals versus budgeted. So, you know, that might change a little bit, but we will be above the 870 mark.
Go ahead, Ms. Margaret, and Sal.
I'm just trying to understand the budget workshop process here because in past years, and I'm sure they didn't do it as well as y'all are going to do it, but it was something that was like a weekend retreat and board members got to ask a whole lot of questions and they went through it, and then it was later another workshop and then it was voted on. This seems a somewhat truncated process. Have they been looking at the budget or is it being presented to them for the first time tonight? And how do they really look into it in depth if it's this short a process?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So, I mean, you all generally ask good questions, so I don't mean to single you out, but look, first of all, we're trying to follow Lone Star governance practice for budgeting. That's Lone Star governance is a TEA framework to help boards and districts administration follow a pretty a good budget process to make sure you're following your priorities and the board goals. So our budgeting process actually started in January when the board got a draft of the district action plan. So the action plan outlines the key things that we're going to do next year, and it outlines our key priorities and gives a general estimate of what that might cost, knowing that this is very preliminary in January. We might have to adjust that as we get NWA scores or things like that, but this is the plan and it starts in January. The next thing the board gets is an action plan budgeting timeline. I won't go too much into that. But the third thing they get is what's called a methodology and parameters paper. What that is it shows how we're going to go about the budgeting process, meaning what are the key principles. And I already told you the biggest principle of that methodology paper is that we would keep cuts away from the classroom as far as possible, that we would prioritize the things in the action plan. So in the action plan, for example, we talk about more NES schools, we talk about CCMR, college career military readiness, doing a little bit more with that. We talk about programs of study that are more geared to year 2035 that we're going to expand in all the schools. We talked about pre-K. So there's several things that we're going to spend money on this coming year. So those were outlined, the principles. It wasn't a budget, but it's also the parameters. For example, we said 850 and then we dropped it to $800 million fund balance. That is a constraint. That is a parameter. We talked about we're going to make sure we still give raises. That's a parameter. We assumed that we're not going to get more state allocation money. We assumed, and it's not a big assumption, but because it's pretty well known, that ESSER monies would stop. Those kinds of things are called parameters and assumptions. So that's that the board got also, and so there's been some questions about those sorts of things. So there's been some questions about that. Then there's been some real broad brush budget numbers that the board received, and then there's been some questions around those that we answer, and then finally they've gotten the draft budget 2 weeks ago or a week ago, 2 weeks ago I think, and we're going to be talking about it tonight.
Just a quick follow on that one. It's just this time last year was around the fourth budget workshop, and this year is the first. I think some folks have concerns about like transparency for the public there. Why is it the first one now, and how would you respond to those concerns?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's a Lone Star governance process that we're following. There's still another month before the board is going to hopefully approve the budget. I think that is June 16th, I believe is the date, at a board meeting in public. So there's time tonight to hear it, and time in June, so and intervening weeks.
Will it be on the website so anybody in the public can read it?
I don't know is the answer to the question. So I'm being told yes, it is.
All right, Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, you talked about the bad practice of using ESSER funds for recurring costs, and looking at the ESSER dashboard, it looks like there's about over 50 million being used for NES startup, stipends, curriculum. Do you consider those to be recurring costs? And if so, like how do you justify that given your criticism of?
Yeah, that's because in the original budget, those schools had ESSER funding for certain positions and things, and so that just carried on. Yes, it's overlaying with NES, so the whole district had, for example, wraparound specialists. So those wraparound specialists are in the NES schools. We didn't take them out. We are now. So that's ESSER funding in those schools, but it was already in the budget.
Yeah, Mr. Miles, you've been putting a lot of blame, if we can say, to the previous administration. Is there any accountability from this administration because of the deficit that is right now? That you're mentioning there's more money going to some schools. So is there something that you probably did that pushed to this deficit?
No. This is good news. This is hard work. This is good work. So we've right-sized the budget, and our financing of this district and the priorities we're making, I think are good for the community, good for kids, good for the schools. So we're right-sizing the budget. Is any budget perfect? No, the budget's not perfect. You're going to find small things here and there throughout. But as a district budget, no, we're doing it right. I challenge any other district to try to find to find the money for a gap of $528 million. That's a hard process. Most districts would choose to decrease their fund balance rather than do the cuts that we've had to do.
Nothing wrong that you've done, or that you think probably you should have spent less, maybe?
So in the budget, what we could have done, we didn't do, is we could have in June, in just 2 weeks, take the budget that the district had given us, yes, and we could have made some cuts. It was a conscious choice not to. Was that a mistake? I don't think so. There was enough going on, and there was enough change that had we said we're going to not hold harmless on enrollment at that time, that would have been, pretty chaotic. So could we have done that? Sure, but we didn't. And if people think that's a mistake, I can see that as a valid criticism.
All right, we got two more questions, Ms. Margaret and then Devin.
You made the point several times tonight, and you've made it before, that there's no more money coming in from the state. Does HISD administration plan to do anything to lobby the state? I thought you did away with the lobbying contracts. I may be wrong.
So I think right now, when you look at what we've been able to do with the money that we have, and I always think that's a first priority for any district. I think the first thing you don't want to do is say, we're not going to be able to get outcomes because the state hasn't given us any money. I don't do that because, first of all, I don't believe that. I usually think in most large districts, this is a unique year, so ESSER complicates things. But even if it wasn't an ESSER year, I would say, look, in most large districts, we can find efficiencies. And let's find the efficiencies first before we go outside and look for more money. And so I think we've done a pretty good job of finding efficiencies this year. There's probably more efficiencies to be made, but certainly if we won't be able to do everything we need to do, increase the salaries we want, the way we want, if we don't get more state allocation. And so when asked, and I've said it now, in front of you, I've said it in front of others, I hope that the legislature would raise the state allocation, the per pupil funding, not just for HIC, but any public district this next year. I hope that happens. My sense is that it will. In the meantime, we're going to try to do the best we can for our kids. And I think next year you're going to see we're going to get the outcomes. We're going to move the district and the process forward, even with no additional funding from the state.
Last question with Devin.
Yeah, I just had one last question that's a bit off topic from the budget. A lot of topic and discussion this week about the charter school stuff, and I just wanted to know and give you the opportunity to set the record straight. Are you still working for the charter school systems?
Yeah, so let me just say this about Third Future Schools. I still help them out a little bit, on the weekend with a phone call or two just to help the transition. But the story has been debunked. It was a nonsensical story, taking advantage of misinformation. It's now been debunked, so I think we can move on from Third Future Schools.
All right, I think that is it.
All right.
It's just a viewer who's watching coming confused. The last time we were here, you referenced 850 million with the fund balance.
450.
And now today, 582. In layman's terms, how can you translate that to people who are watching at home?
Yeah,
What that
so
means for them, the difference there.
450.
Yes, excuse me.
450 was a draft. Since that time, we found more ESSER money that's infused in recurrent expenses, or I didn't. The finance department is looking at it closely every time when we looked at programs, and there's lots and lots of programs and things. And so the more accurate number is 528. You'll get even a more accurate number tonight, and that might change a little bit as we, again, do budget to actuals through the rest of this year.
All right, folks, thank y'all so much. Superintendent, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.